The death toll from Colombia's earthquake just crossed 130, and scientists studying the fault that caused it are delivering a warning that should worry everyone still living across the disaster zone. This is not over. The same deep, poorly understood rupture that leveled buildings across western Colombia is still actively producing aftershocks, and researchers say there's no way to guarantee the worst has already happened. Let's start with where things actually stand right now, because the numbers have been climbing fast since the initial magnitude. 7.4 earthquake struck at 7:34 in the morning on August 10th. According to Colombia's Association of Capital Cities, at least 132 people have been confirmed dead, with 570 more injured, and those figures include at least 60 deaths in the western city of Pereira alone, along with roughly 40 more in the Risaralda region, part of the country's coffee-growing heartland. Newly inaugurated President Abelardo de la Espriella has declared a national state of emergency, describing his administration's first priority as rescuing people still trapped beneath collapsed buildings. Officials have reported around 5,000 homes damaged or destroyed, 7 airports forced to suspend operations, and disruptions to hospitals, roads, energy, and telecommunications across the hardest hit regions, with cities including Pereira, Cali, Quibdó, Manizales, and Armenia all placed under red alert, the country's highest possible disaster classification. Here's the detail that makes this earthquake so genuinely difficult for scientists to fully explain, and why the phrase "the fault isn't done" carries real scientific weight rather than just sounding like a dramatic headline. This earthquake did not happen the way most people picture an earthquake happening. It struck at a depth of 107 kilometers, deep beneath the surface, inside the slab of oceanic crust that has been slowly sinking into the Earth's mantle for millions of years as part of the subduction zone running along Colombia's Pacific coast. This region sits at the convergence of the Nazca, South American, and Caribbean tectonic plates, an area already known for producing frequent seismic activity. But this particular inland from the actual plate boundary immediately stood out to researchers as something unusual. Earthquakes that occur inside a subducting slab, rather than along the boundary where two plates grind against each other, are called intra-slab earthquakes, and scientists studying them are candid about how much remains unresolved. The exact physical mechanism that triggers a rupture this large, this deep inside a slab of bending, heating rock, remains a subject of genuine scientific debate, with competing theories involving mineral transformations occurring under extreme pressure and temperature, none of which has been definitively confirmed. Before we go further into why aftershock risk remains so serious in the days ahead, if breaking global disasters like this are exactly what you come here for, do yourself a favor and hit like and subscribe, because we track developments like this as they continue to unfold. So what does it actually mean when scientists say this fault isn't done? In the hours immediately following the main shock, at least 21 aftershocks were recorded, including one measuring magnitude 5.0 that struck roughly 10 miles west of the original epicenter near San Jose del Palmar, less than an hour after the initial rupture. Aftershock sequences like this typically follow a predictable pattern of gradually decreasing frequency over time, but predictable does not mean risk-free, and it certainly does not mean finished. Buildings across the disaster zone that have already been structurally weakened by the main shock remain vulnerable to collapse from aftershocks that would otherwise be considered minor under normal circumstances. A magnitude 4.5 aftershock, striking a building that survived a magnitude 7.4 main shock only barely, with cracked support columns and compromised foundations, can be enough to bring that same structure down completely, which is exactly why rescue and recovery teams working through the rubble right now are operating under constant real-time risk from the ground continuing to move beneath them. This earthquake's depth also explains why the damage pattern across Colombia looks the way it does, spread across such a wide geographic area rather than concentrated tightly around a single epicenter. Deep earthquakes produce a very different kind of shaking pattern compared to shallow ones. Because the rupture originated 107 kilometers underground, the difference in distance between a point directly above the earthquake and a point 100 kilometers away, measured all the way down to the actual source of the rupture, becomes surprisingly small. Simple geometry means both locations end up roughly the same distance from where the energy actually originated. That is part of why cities as far apart as Cali, Pereira, Quibdó, Manizales, and Armenia all experienced serious damage simultaneously, rather than the destruction concentrating narrowly around the epicenter itself. And it is also why the quake was felt as far away as Ecuador and Panama. The location of some of this destruction carries a particularly painful weight for residents in Colombia's coffee-growing region. Armenia, one of the cities hit hardest this week, was devastated once before by a magnitude 6.1 earthquake back in 1999. An event that killed nearly 1,200 people and left an estimated 250,000 people homeless, making it the country's worst natural disaster in decades at the time. For residents old enough to remember that catastrophe, watching buildings collapse in the same region once again has understandably reopened wounds that never fully healed, with many describing the fear of a second major disaster striking their community within a single generation. Emergency response teams are currently facing challenges that go well beyond simply locating people trapped in the rubble. Organizations coordinating relief on the ground have described the immediate priority as finding structurally safe spaces to actually operate from, given the ongoing aftershock risk, followed closely by the logistical challenge of maintaining refrigeration and supply chains for emergency food and medical resources in a region where roads, energy infrastructure, and telecommunications have all been significantly disrupted. Vice President José Manuel Restrepo has traveled to Manizales personally to lead a unified command post coordinating the national response, describing the moment as one that demands both solidarity and immediate action across every level of government, a message echoed by officials in each of the other hard-hit cities working simultaneously to stabilize their own local emergency response efforts. There's also a broader regional context that makes this earthquake feel especially alarming to people across northwestern South America. Less than 2 months before this quake struck Colombia, a magnitude of 7.5 earthquake devastated northern Venezuela, an event so catastrophic that its death toll has since climbed above 6,000 people, with tens of thousands still reported missing. That Venezuelan earthquake was fundamentally different in nature, a shallow rupture occurring right at the surface, rather, than deep within a subducting slab like this week's quake in Colombia. But the timing of two major deadly earthquakes striking neighboring countries within such a short window has understandably put the entire region on edge. Scientists are now watching this broader stretch of northwestern South America, where the Nazca, South American and Caribbean tectonic plates all converge, with an intensity that reflects just how seismically active this corner of the planet has proven to be in recent months. What happens next depends heavily on how the aftershock sequence continues to behave over the coming days and weeks. Seismologists generally expect aftershock frequency to decrease predictably over time, following a pattern where roughly 10% as many aftershocks occur on day 10 as occurred on day 1. But that statistical pattern offers no guarantee against a larger aftershock striking unexpectedly, particularly given how much scientific uncertainty still surrounds the exact mechanism that triggered this earthquake in the first place. Researchers are also expected to use satellite radar imaging over the coming week to study ground deformation across the affected region, though because this earthquake occurred so deep underground rather than rupturing the surface directly, that technique is expected to provide less definitive information than it typically does for shallow earthquakes. It also helps to understand why an intraplate region like this one is so much harder for scientists to model with confidence compared to a well-studied fault system like California's San Andreas. Along a boundary fault, decades of continuous monitoring and repeated earthquake activity give researchers a detailed picture of exactly how stress builds and releases over time, allowing for reasonably confident probability estimates about future activity. A deep intraslab rupture like the one that struck Colombia this week behaves according to physical processes that are simply less thoroughly mapped out, since large earthquakes at this specific depth and in this specific tectonic setting occur far less frequently, leaving scientists with a smaller body of past events to compare against. That scientific gap is precisely why researchers are being unusually direct in cautioning that this fault system remains active and unpredictable, rather than offering the kind of confident reassurance that a better understood fault might allow. The scale of destruction has also forced a difficult reckoning around building codes and construction standards across the affected region. Many of the structures that collapsed this week, including hospitals and schools, according to early reports, were built decades ago, in some cases before modern seismic engineering standards were widely adopted or consistently enforced across Colombia's rapidly growing cities. Engineers who have studied past Colombian earthquakes have long warned that a significant portion of the country's building stock, particularly older, densely packed urban construction in cities like Cali and Pereira, was never designed to withstand shaking of this intensity, a warning that this week's disaster has now tragically confirmed in the clearest possible terms. Rebuilding efforts in the weeks and months ahead are expected to reignite long-standing debates over stricter enforcement of seismic building codes, especially in a country that, despite its well-documented earthquake history, has struggled at times to translate that awareness into consistently retrofitted infrastructure. International relief organizations have also begun mobilizing resources to support Colombia's response, working alongside government agencies to establish emergency shelters, distribute food and medical supplies, and begin the painstaking process of search and recovery across multiple simultaneously affected cities. Coordinating a response of this scale across several major urban centers at once rather than a single concentrated disaster zone, presents its own significant logistical challenge, requiring relief organizations to essentially run parallel operations in Cali, Pereira, Quibdó, Manizales, and Armenia simultaneously, each with its own damaged infrastructure, disrupted transportation routes, and localized shortages of essential supplies. For survivors across the region, the psychological toll of an ongoing aftershock sequence is proving to be its own significant burden, layered on top of the physical destruction itself. Residents across multiple cities have described sleeping outdoors, structurally sound but could still be compromised beneath the surface, with sirens periodically sounding in cities as far away as Bogota as a precaution against further shaking. That combination of physical danger and psychological strain, not knowing whether the next tremor will be a harmless minor aftershock or something considerably more destructive, is exactly the kind of uncertainty that scientists studying this fault say could persist for weeks, based on how similar aftershock sequences have historically unfolded following major earthquakes of comparable size and depth. For the millions of people across western Colombia currently living under red alert conditions, sleeping outside their damaged homes or sheltering in makeshift accommodations while aftershocks continue rattling the region, the message from scientists is sobering but necessary to hear clearly. The immediate crisis, triggered by Monday's main shocking, is far from resolved. The fault responsible for this disaster remains active and unpredictable by the standards of current seismological understanding. And the coming days will require the same level of caution and preparedness that defined the first catastrophic hours after the ground first began to shake. Search and rescue teams, government officials, and residents alike are being asked to hold two realities at once, mourning a rapidly rising death toll while simultaneously remaining braced for a fault system that scientists themselves admit they do not yet fully understand, in a region now forced to grapple with the reality that this earthquake may not be the last major surprise this particular stretch of subducting crust has in store. If you want to stay informed the moment major disasters like this one develop before they hit your regular newsfeed, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel, because we will keep tracking this earthquake and its aftermath as new information comes in.